Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. When I was younger, maybe 14 or 15, my family used to go camping at this big state park every summer. It wasn't anything fancy, just a big stretch of forest with a few dirt roads, campsites, and a lake in the middle. The kind of place where you could smell pine needles all day and hear crickets the moment the sun started to go down. We'd set up our tent, get the campfire going, and spend most of the evenings roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and just sitting around watching the smoke twist into the night sky. Those trips became something I looked forward to every year. There was this one tradition my friend and I started during those trips. We called it the ritual. Every night after everyone else went to bed, we'd grab our flashlights and go for a walk through the woods. It started as something simple, just a short walk around the trails near the campsites. But over time, we got bolder. We'd go deeper into the woods, away from the noise of people and the glow of campfires. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The air felt heavier, cooler, and every sound carried differently out there. It wasn't scary at first. It felt like an adventure, like we were exploring a world that didn't exist during the day. That one night, though, it stands out clearly in my memory. It was late, probably close to midnight. The campfire at our site had burned down to glowing embers, and most of the park was completely silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. My friend and I decided to start the ritual a little earlier than usual. We had 2 flashlights, but we had this habit of turning them off once we were far enough from the campsite, trying to see how well we could navigate using only the faint moonlight that filtered through the branches. It made everything feel sharper, more alive. The sound of our footsteps crunching the dry leaves was the only thing breaking the stillness. We took one of the smaller trails that branched off from the main one we hadn't gone down before. It wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and the underbrush denser the further we went. The air smelled damp like moss and dirt, and the ground under our shoes started getting soft. We must have been at least half a mile from the nearest campsite when the trail seemed to fade away into the woods, more like animal tracks than a real path. We kept going anyway, laughing quietly at how far we'd gone. Then somewhere behind us we heard it. At first it was so soft I thought it was just the wind, a faint whispering sound. Not quite words, more like breath moving through the trees. I stopped walking, thinking maybe it was the sound of leaves rubbing together. But it didn't stop. It was too steady, too deliberate. My friend must have heard it too because he turned his flashlight on without saying anything. We spun around, the beam cutting through the darkness, catching on tree trunks and low bushes. Nothing. Just empty woods stretching back the way we came. We laughed it off, pretending it was nothing, but there was something about that sound that stuck with me. The forest was so still, even the insects seemed quiet, like they were listening too. We kept walking, maybe a bit faster this time. The trail was barely visible now, but the moonlight caught on the edges of things. Branches, rocks, the occasional patch of dry leaves, and that was enough to keep us going. A few minutes later, we heard it again. The same whispering, but closer. This time it was clearer. The sound of someone breathing words softly, like they were trying not to be heard. We stopped dead in our tracks. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned on my flashlight again and swept it across the woods. The beam caught nothing but endless trees. My friend's light flicked in another direction, and for a second I thought I saw movement. A quick, low motion near the ground, like something crawling or dragging itself along. We froze. The whispering stopped. Everything went silent again. I remember standing there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Then the whispering started again, even softer now, like it was right behind us but still out of sight. That was enough for us. We turned around and started heading back toward camp, keeping the flashlights on this time. The woods that had felt like a playground minutes ago now felt like a maze. Every sound made us jump. the crack of a twig, the brush of a branch against our shoulders. We'd only been walking for a minute or two when my flashlight caught something on the ground up ahead. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. It was a person, a woman, crawling on her hands and knees through the dirt and leaves. She was whispering, random words that didn't make any sense, just muttering them like she was talking to herself. Her hair hung down over her face, tangled and dirty. Her clothes were dark, and her skin looked pale under the flashlight. For a moment I couldn't move. It was one of those moments where your brain doesn't catch up with what your eyes are seeing. She didn't seem to notice us at first. She just kept crawling, her hands digging into the dirt, whispering to herself. Then she looked up. Her eyes caught the light, wide and confused, and for a second it felt like she wasn't really seeing us, just looking past us into the trees. She stood up slowly, swaying a little. Her face was smeared with dirt and she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. There was this moment where she just stared at us, and I remember thinking she didn't belong there, not like she had wandered too far, but like she'd come from somewhere completely different, a place where people didn't walk straight anymore or speak clearly. Then she said something about looking for her campsite. We didn't know what to do. It was obvious she was messed up. Her voice slurred, her movements clumsy. We figured she was either drunk or high. We tried to help her back toward the campground, though it wasn't easy. She kept stopping, mumbling things under her breath, pointing in random directions like she didn't remember which way to go. Every few steps she'd whisper something again, almost like she was continuing a conversation with herself. The walk back felt like it took forever. The woods seemed darker than before and the air heavier. My flashlight kept catching her face, and every time it did, she looked a little different. Eyes glassy, mouth twitching, still whispering. When we finally saw the glow of campfires again, I felt this huge wave of relief. We brought her into the campground area and started looking around for her group. We walked her past a few campsites until we found a group of people sitting around a fire, talking and laughing. The moment they saw her, one of them stood up and called her name, surprised. They came over and started apologizing, saying she had wandered off earlier to find the bathroom, and they thought she'd just gone to sleep somewhere. They didn't even realize she was missing. Turned out she had gotten drunk and high, then decided to take a walk in the middle of the night, and somehow ended up deep in the woods, completely lost. After a few minutes, they thanked us and led her back to their site. She stumbled along, still muttering softly to herself, and I remember watching her disappear into the shadows of the trees and thinking how close she'd been to spending the entire night out there, alone. We went back to our tent after that, but neither of us slept for a while. Every sound outside the tent made us flinch. Even the soft rustle of leaves sounded like whispering again. Lying there, I kept thinking about how strange it was that we decided to walk that far into the woods that night. We never went that deep before, and if we hadn't, she might still have been crawling out there until morning. Or worse. By the time the sun came up, the whole thing felt almost unreal. In the daylight, the woods looked calm and harmless again. But I couldn't stop picturing her face when she looked up at us, her eyes blank and lost, whispering to no one. It made me realize how thin that line is between feeling safe and being completely alone in the dark. After that, the ritual never felt the same. We still went on walks, but we never went that far again. The woods were different now. The darkness wasn't just exciting anymore. It had weight, like something waiting quietly just beyond the reach of the light. And sometimes, even years later, when I walk through the woods at night, I still catch myself listening for that same sound, the faint, broken whisper of someone lost in the dark, trying to find their way back. We had been planning that camping trip for weeks. Back then in high school, getting away from everything felt like the biggest adventure we could have. There were 5 of us, me, Ryan, Luke, Josh, and Tyler, and we wanted to hike deep into the woods, away from roads, lights, or any kind of comfort. We were tired of hearing cars and seeing streetlights. We wanted complete silence and darkness, the kind you only find far from civilization. We packed light but enough to survive a few days. Cheap tents, sleeping bags, canned food, and a small camping stove. The trail we picked started off clear but got rough fast, twisting into steep sections where tree roots clawed out of the dirt and fallen branches blocked the path. It took us hours just to reach the spot we picked to camp. The air got cooler the higher we climbed, and the trees started to feel thicker and taller, crowding out the sunlight until it felt like walking through a tunnel. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low, bleeding orange light across the tops of the trees. The clearing wasn't big, just a patch of uneven ground with a few scattered rocks and a small stream trickling nearby. The view beyond the trees dropped off into rolling hills, fading into mist. It felt far, really far from anything. No sounds of cars, no hum of electricity, just wind and forest. We were exhausted. Our backs ached from carrying heavy packs, and our shirts were stuck to our skin with sweat. None of us said much while setting up the tents. The air smelled like damp soil and pine sap. Every time I looked around, I noticed how still the forest seemed. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Once camp was set up, we made a small fire. The wood hissed and cracked, sending sparks up into the growing darkness. We ate from cans and passed around a bag of chips, too tired to even talk much. I remember staring into the fire, feeling the warmth against my face while the air around me turned cold. The forest beyond the orange glow of the flames felt massive and endless. Every few minutes I would catch myself glancing into the dark tree line, half expecting to see something move. When we finally went to our tents, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling that deep exhaustion that hits after a long day outside. The kind where your body hurts, but your mind feels heavy and calm. My tent was small, just enough space for me and my bag. The nylon walls were thin enough that I could hear everything outside. The sound of the stream, the faint hum of the wind moving through the branches, and occasionally a soft crack somewhere in the distance, like a branch giving way under weight. I must have fallen asleep for a while, because the next thing I remember was waking up in the pitch dark. My first thought was how silent it was. The fire had long since gone out, and even the stream seemed quieter. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, something moving outside. At first it was faint, a soft crunch of leaves or maybe a small step. My half-asleep brain told me it was probably just one of the guys getting up to pee, so I closed my eyes again. But then I heard another sound, then another. The noises weren't coming from one spot, they were around me. Slow steps, shifting weight, the sound of something brushing against a branch. The hairs on my arms lifted. I held my breath and listened. The sounds were getting clearer, heavier. They weren't random movements. It was like something was circling the tent. I couldn't move for a few seconds. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical reason. Maybe animals. Maybe one of my friends walking around. But there were too many footsteps, and they weren't light like a raccoon or fox. They had weight to them, the kind of dull, deliberate weight of something big. I slowly reached for my flashlight. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I felt the tremor in my hand. I didn't want to turn it on. A big part of me didn't want to see what was out there. But the waiting was worse than not knowing. The soft sound of movement continued, circling the tent in uneven intervals. Every few seconds I could hear something step on a twig, or the faint rustle of leaves being pushed aside. Finally, I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness, slicing a narrow tunnel of light through the tent wall. I hesitated, then unzipped the front of the tent just enough to peek out. The zipper sounded painfully loud, each tooth dragging in slow motion. When I pushed the flap aside and shined the light outside, my stomach dropped. Eyes, dozens of them. They caught the light like mirrors, glowing pale and sharp in the darkness. They weren't small or close to the ground either. They were high, at about my height or taller. For a second I thought they were people standing out there, silently surrounding the tent. My throat went dry. The light from the flashlight wavered in my shaking hand. The forest was pitch black beyond that narrow beam, and all I could see were those reflections, pairs of large, still eyes staring right back at me. I froze. My body felt heavy and numb. I couldn't even hear my heartbeat. Everything seemed to stop. The eyes didn't move. None of them made a sound. Just that strange, still staring. I tried to make sense of it. There were too many for it to be people, and they were too close together. Then one of them blinked, a slow, vertical blink. Another set shifted slightly, and I saw the outline of a head, long ears flicking backward. Deer. It hit me all at once, and I almost laughed from the relief. A whole herd of deer was standing around the tents, their bodies nearly invisible in the dark except for their eyes. The flashlight must have startled them when I turned it on, but they didn't bolt. They just stood still, curious and cautious. Now that my panic started to fade, I noticed the faint shapes of their bodies. The light caught the edges of fur and movement, the rise and fall of their heads as they sniffed the air. They were big, bigger than I had imagined deer up close. A few of the males had antlers, tall and sharp-looking in the faint light. Their size was enough to make my heart still race. Seeing that many of them together, silent and unmoving, felt unnatural in the dark. I lowered the flashlight and slowly zipped the tent shut again. The sound of the zipper was soft, almost swallowed by the silence. I lay back down, trying to steady my breathing. The deer moved again outside, soft steps in the grass and leaves, the faint huff of their breath. After a few minutes, the sounds began to fade. One by one, they wandered off, their hooves making faint cracks as they disappeared back into the trees. I stayed awake long after the last sound faded, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. The fear still lingered even though I knew it was just deer. The image of all those eyes floating in the dark stuck in my mind. By morning, the clearing looked normal again. Sunlight broke through the trees, and the forest felt calm and familiar. There were hoof prints everywhere in the soft dirt around our tents. Some of them came within just a few feet of where I had been sleeping. When I stepped out, the air was cold and clean, and everything was still except for the stream. It was strange to think that only a few hours before, I had been lying there in the dark, convinced something was hunting us. The others started waking up one by one, groaning and stretching, complaining about sore backs and the hard ground. I didn't say much about what happened. It felt different in the daylight, almost silly, but part of me couldn't shake the image of those eyes at man height, reflecting back in silence. That morning, while packing up, I caught myself glancing into the woods every now and then. Even knowing what it had been, I couldn't stop picturing that moment, the instant before I realized they were deer, when my mind filled in every possible thing that could have been out there. Fear has a strange way of stretching time. Those few seconds of looking into the dark had felt like forever. I could still remember the cold air against my skin, the way the flashlight beam trembled, the quiet weight of being surrounded. We hiked back down that day, tired but content. The woods seemed friendlier in the light, filled with birdsong and wind again. But every time I camp now, no matter how tired I am, I always hesitate before turning off the flashlight. I listen a little longer, and if I hear something move outside, I always remember that night, lying still in the dark, surrounded by eyes that glowed at human height, waiting for me to look back. It was just deer, but in the dark, before you know what's out there, your mind can turn anything into something much worse. I've camped a lot in my life. Sometimes with my wife, sometimes with friends, sometimes just with my dog. It's the kind of thing I do to get away from everything for a bit. But a few trips still sit heavy in the back of my mind, and when I think about them, I still feel that same quiet unease I felt in the moment. When you realize that being alone in nature doesn't mean you're safe. It just means there's no one around if something goes wrong. One of those times was a trip with my wife. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away. We picked a forested site, full of jack pines, a little bit off the main campground, but still easy enough to reach with our car. The air was calm when we set up. A light breeze moved through the trees, the sound like waves breaking far away. We got the tent up, built a fire, and cooked dinner as the sun dropped behind the line of trees. Everything felt fine until around midnight. That's when the wind started. At first, it was just a few gusts that tugged at the tarp. Then the sound changed. It was a deep rolling rush that moved through the forest in waves, a noise that made the trees moan. I sat up and listened. The tent walls puffed in and out like lungs. My wife was already awake, eyes wide in the dim light from my flashlight. We didn't say anything, then it hit, hard. The trees started snapping. You could hear them go one by one. The sharp crack of trunks splitting followed by the heavy crash as they hit the ground. The sound came from every direction, echoing through the dark. The ground shuddered under us. I pulled her closer, feeling the tent bow inward, poles creaking. Pine needles and small branches started hitting the tent, some scraping down the sides like fingernails. For half an hour, we sat there listening to the wind rip through the forest. Every few seconds there was another crash, another tree down. We were surrounded by jack pine, tall, thin, and brittle when they catch strong wind. It sounded like the forest was being torn apart. I remember thinking how flimsy the fabric walls of the tent were, how one wrong fall from a nearby tree would flatten us completely. I wanted to get out, to move somewhere safer, but stepping out into that chaos felt even worse. When the storm finally calmed, it left a deep stillness behind. No wind, no animals, no movement, just the smell of torn pine and damp earth. We unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The flashlight beam cut through the fog of broken branches. Around us, dozens of trees were down, some just feet away. Big trunks lying across others, roots torn from the ground. The air was heavy and strange. That was the first time I really understood how small we were out there. But that wasn't the creepiest thing that's happened to me while camping. The creepiest was with my best friend a few years later. It was late summer, and we decided to check out a semi-remote camping area that I'd heard about but never visited. You could drive to it if you had a good 4x4, though most people wouldn't bother. It wasn't an official campground, just a rough clearing with a few fire pits, a couple of old picnic tables, and a run-down outhouse. I think the parks people checked it maybe once a year, if that. We got there in the late afternoon. The air smelled like dust and pine sap. The place was empty. No vehicles, no sounds except the wind moving through the tall grass. We picked a flat spot near a fire pit and started unpacking. My buddy wandered off toward the outhouse while I worked on setting up the tent. After a minute, I noticed he wasn't coming back right away. He just stood at the door of the first outhouse looking in. Then he shut the door slowly and went to the second one. A few minutes later, he came back, quiet, kind of thoughtful looking. He told me I should go look in that first one. I thought maybe some animal had died in there or someone had left a mess. When I opened the door, though, the smell hit first. Not bad, just odd, like fabric and dust. The light came through a small crack in the wall, and there on the floor were 3 full backpacks. Big ones, the kind you'd use for week-long trips. They were lined up neatly, like someone had just set them down and left. Curiosity got the better of us, so we opened them. The first 2 were full of camping gear, good stuff too. Sleeping bags, a stove, dehydrated food, clothes. Everything folded and packed properly. The third bag was different. When I unzipped it, all I saw was color. Red, yellow, green, purple, Skittles. Dozens of bags of them. Some bulk, some small. All packed tight into every pocket and compartment. It had to be close to 80 liters of candy. All different flavors. It didn't make any sense. We joked about it at first, but after a while the weirdness of it settled in. 3 people's worth of gear maybe. 2 seemed normal, 1 just full of Skittles. No sign of who it belonged to. No vehicles around. No tracks except ours. The place was so remote that you'd have to drive out of your way to reach it. And even then, you'd only know about it if you'd been there before. We camped there for 4 days. Never saw another person. Not a single car passed the road nearby. The forest around us stayed quiet, like even the animals didn't come close to that place. Every morning we'd check the outhouse just to see if anything had changed. The bags never moved. The air inside stayed still and cold. When we packed up and left, we reported it to the conservation officers back in town. They wrote it down, nodded, and said they'd check it out. I don't know if they ever did. Sometimes I still think about those bags, about how neatly they were placed, how untouched everything looked. Who leaves behind full gear and that much candy? Why hide it there of all places? Maybe it was some strange stash. Maybe it meant something to someone. I'll never know. The last time I truly felt scared camping wasn't from something strange. It was from something human. I'd taken my dog on a short backpacking trip. It wasn't deep in the wilderness, maybe a couple of miles off the road, but far enough that you couldn't hear traffic. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, so I didn't have much gear. Just a tarp, a sleeping pad, a small fire, and my pack. I set up camp near a small rise in the ground, surrounded by trees and brush. It was quiet, the kind of still that makes you feel alone but comfortable. Around midnight, I was half asleep when I heard an engine. A truck maybe half a mile away. The sound bounced through the trees, then got louder. I sat up, listening. The dog's ears perked. The engine revved and stopped suddenly. And then came voices. Shouting, laughing, slurred, drunk. I told myself they were probably just locals out for a late ride, maybe camping somewhere nearby. But then came the gunshots. Sharp cracks, then bursts. The sound echoed off the trees, confusing the direction, but it felt close, too close. My heart started hammering. The dog was rigid beside me, low growl deep in his throat. I killed the fire and crouched there in the dark, trying to make sense of where they were. Another volley went off and bits of bark chipped off a tree not far from us. That's when I realized they were shooting in our direction. Maybe not on purpose, but close enough that it didn't matter. I packed up fast, stuffing things into my bag without caring how they fit. The dog stayed close, leash short. Every few minutes I heard another shout, another pop of gunfire. I moved slow at first, staying low, trying not to make noise. Then I heard laughter, close, somewhere downhill, and I started moving faster. My flashlight stayed off. I just followed the faint glow of the stars through the breaks in the canopy, stepping over roots and brush. The ground was uneven, but adrenaline kept me from feeling tired or scared of tripping. When we finally reached the dirt road, I could still hear them faintly behind me. More laughter, one more shot. The sound faded as I got farther away. I walked until I reached where I'd parked, heart still pounding, dog still shaking slightly against my leg. I didn't sleep that night. I drove home, watching the dark forest pass in the headlights. The air inside the truck smelled like pine and smoke and fear. Looking back on all of it now, I think what makes those moments stick with me isn't the danger or the weirdness. It's the way the world can suddenly turn from peaceful to terrifying without warning. One minute you're sitting by a fire under the stars, and the next you're realizing how far you are from anyone who could help you. How alone you really are. The forest has that power. It's beautiful, calm, and quiet, but it doesn't care if you're there. When the wind hits, the trees fall. When someone leaves 3 backpacks full of candy in an outhouse, you'll never know why. And when drunk strangers start shooting in the night, you realize just how thin the line is between adventure and disaster. I still camp, but I do it differently now. I pick my spots carefully, check the maps, make sure I know the roads. I listen to the wind a little more closely. And every time I see a rundown outhouse or hear laughter echoing from somewhere unseen, that feeling comes back. The same uneasy reminder that out there, even in the quietest places, something can always go wrong. It was one of those trips that started with more excitement than planning. A group of us, 7 in total, had decided to head out into the middle of nowhere, Arizona, for a long weekend of camping. It was late spring, hot during the day and cool at night, and we thought we were getting away from everything, work, people, noise, and stress. None of us really knew how far middle of nowhere went until we drove past the last sign of pavement, watching the asphalt crumble into pale dust in scrubland. The desert stretched out in every direction, endless, dotted with saguaro cactus and sharp brown rock faces that caught the last red light of the sun. We reached our chosen spot at dusk. It was flat and open, the kind of place that makes you feel small because there's nothing around you except wind and emptiness. No cell service, no lights in the distance. Just a single dirt track that looked like it hadn't been driven in months. We set up camp in a loose circle, 2 tents for sleeping, a small fire pit in the center, and our coolers and folding chairs arranged nearby. The desert got quiet as soon as the sun went down. so quiet that you could hear the wind slide through the cactus needles and the soft rustle of sand shifting under your boots. I remember thinking how clean the air felt, how the stars looked sharper than they ever did in the city. We made dinner over the fire, simple stuff, hot dogs, some canned beans, chips, and opened a few beers. Everyone was laughing, telling stories. Someone had brought a speaker, and we played music until the fire burned down to embers. There was no sense of danger then, just the easy feeling of being far away from anything that could bother us. When we finally went to sleep, I remember how cold it suddenly felt. The desert always drops in temperature at night, and I could feel it even through the sleeping bag. I was half asleep when I heard it. The slow, steady sound of something moving just outside the tent. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft, wet sniffing noise against the fabric. My first thought was that it had to be a bear, or maybe a coyote. Maybe one of my dumb friends had forgotten to tie up the trash or left food out. The sniffing moved around the tent, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever it was trying to figure out what was inside. My heart was pounding. I could hear the others shifting in their sleeping bags, holding their breath. We didn't say a word. You could feel the tension, the kind that wraps around you and squeezes tight. The noise circled once more, then faded a little. A few seconds later I heard it again, but farther away, near the next tent. That's when I realized everyone in my tent was awake. I could feel their movement, the way one of them tensed and reached for their flashlight but didn't turn it on. We were all listening to the same thing, the sound of something human. It wasn't an animal. The sniffing wasn't random. It was steady, like someone deliberately breathing in close to the tent. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. A zipper suddenly broke the silence. It came from the other tent. One of my friends had decided to burst out, yelling and stomping, making as much noise as he could. I heard his boots hit the dirt, then a loud shout that echoed into the desert. I could hear the scrape of movement, something scurrying fast, followed by a confused few seconds of shouting and heavy footsteps. When I finally dared to unzip the tent flap a few inches, I saw his flashlight beam swinging wildly in the dark. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any kind of animal. It was a man, a stranger. He had gone through our coolers, scattered food everywhere, and had been moving around the tents, sniffing them. My friend yelled again, chasing him off into the dark. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of him just once. A tall figure, dirty, barefoot maybe, his clothes dark and torn, disappearing into the scrub. We never heard him speak. He just ran until he vanished into the black. Nobody slept after that. We packed everything up in a blur. The fire was barely out, and we were throwing things into the trucks without saying much. It felt like the night itself was closing in around us, heavy and alive. The drive back toward civilization felt endless. Headlights cutting through the dust and brush. Nobody saying a word. By the time we hit the first paved road, it was nearly dawn. That should have been it. A one-time scare. Something to tell later as a story. But a year later, we went back. We were stupid to do it. But we convinced ourselves it was an isolated thing. A random drifter or some desert weirdo passing through. We even joked about it when planning the next trip. "Let's see if he's still out there," someone said, and we all laughed. The idea that it could happen again didn't seem real. We went to the same general area, but farther off the main dirt road this time, down into a shallow wash surrounded by low desert hills. We tried to be smarter about it. Instead of pitching tents, we decided to sleep in our trucks and SUVs, thinking we'd be safer and harder to approach. We parked in a circle with our tailgates and back doors facing inward toward a small campfire. We had food again, coolers stacked in the middle, and our chairs around the fire. It was windless that night, the stars clear, the desert silent except for the occasional chirp of insects or the distant cry of something out there. We sat up late, drinking and talking, but there was this unspoken thing in the air. Everyone remembered last year. Every crunch in the brush made us pause. Every flicker of shadow near the fire made someone glance over their shoulder. Eventually, we all climbed into our vehicles and tried to sleep. I was in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend, a blanket over us, the back window cracked just a little for air. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting dim light around the camp. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No wind, no sound at all except my own breathing and the faint snore of someone sleeping near the fire. Then suddenly my face lit up with a bright light. It was sharp and direct, like a flashlight beam aimed right through the back window. My eyes watered from it. My first instinct was to sit up, to shout or move, but something in me said not to. Something deep in my gut told me to stay still, to pretend to be asleep. I could feel my girlfriend breathing next to me, quick and shallow, and I knew she was awake too. I didn't dare look at her. The light stayed on us for a few long seconds, then slowly moved away. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate ones, on the dirt outside. Crunching, circling, then the light hit the next truck. I could see it sweep across the ground, then up against the side of a vehicle, onto the faces of my friends sleeping inside. I lifted my head just enough to see. It wasn't a ranger or another camper. It was an older man, thin, tall, wearing some kind of worn-out jacket and jeans that looked dirty, stiff with dust. His face was hard to make out, but I could see the shape of it in the light from the dying fire. Lined, gray, maybe unshaven. He didn't look lost. He didn't look scared. He looked calm, like someone taking a slow walk through familiar ground. He just stood there, shining his light into each truck bed one by one. Watching. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. It was like we were all frozen, each of us pretending to sleep, hoping he'd just go away. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. The beam drifted again, back toward the middle of camp where our coolers sat. I could hear him rummaging through them quietly. The sound of bottles clinking, a cooler lid shutting. After what felt like forever, his flashlight went off. For a moment, I couldn't see anything at all, just pitch black and the faint orange glow from the coals. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps again, slowly fading toward the darkness beyond camp. I lay there waiting, counting the seconds, trying to tell if he was really gone. When I finally couldn't hear anything else, I sat up. My girlfriend did the same. I looked over and saw movement in the other trucks. My friends were waking up too, their faces pale in the faint light. Nobody needed to say a word. We all knew what we'd seen. We waited another minute, maybe two, to make sure he was gone. Then we got out. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight. I scanned the edge of the wash, the rocky slope leading up to the open desert. Nothing, just shadows. We didn't even bother packing properly this time. We just threw everything into the vehicles as fast as we could. Someone poured dirt over the fire. Another grabbed the cooler lids that had been left open. We left garbage behind, chairs still unfolded. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out. Driving out of there, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. Every bend in the dirt track, every flash of reflection in the brush made me think I saw him again, standing there watching us leave. We didn't stop until the sky started to lighten, and the first thin line of morning stretched across the desert. When we reached the highway, we pulled over just to breathe, to look at each other and make sure we were all still there. Nobody had to say what we were thinking. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't some lost hiker. Whoever that man was, he'd known where we were. He'd come out there in the middle of the night twice to watch people sleep. I don't camp in Arizona anymore. Not in the desert, not anywhere that quiet. I still think about how calm he looked, how sure he was of himself, how he moved like he'd done it before. The desert feels too big now, too open, too easy to disappear in. And every time I drive past the endless flat land outside Tucson, I can't help but think that he's still out there somewhere, just waiting. It was a cold, clear morning when I set out, the kind that makes every sound in the woods seem sharper, every step on the frosted grass sound like breaking glass. The sky was pale blue, the kind of blue that means the sun hasn't quite made up its mind whether to rise or stay behind the horizon. I was out in the bush hunting upland birds, grouse mostly, maybe a pheasant if I was lucky. My shotgun was slung comfortably in my hands, and I had my orange vest zipped up tight. It was quiet, just the faint crunch of my boots and the steady sound of my own breathing. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles, cold and clean in a way you only ever get miles from town. The area I was hunting wasn't exactly new to me, but it wasn't somewhere I went often either. It was one of those places that doesn't have many trails marked on the map, just stretches of forest and low hills, a few overgrown logging roads that had turned into hunting paths over the years. I'd parked my truck near a wide clearing, checked my compass, and started cutting through a low valley that I figured would shave some time off getting to another ridge where I'd flushed birds in the past. The valley was narrow, with tall trees crowding close on both sides, and the ground was uneven from old washouts. The further I went, the darker it seemed to get, even though the morning light was starting to break through the treetops. There's a certain kind of quiet in those woods that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. No birds calling, no wind moving through the branches. Just stillness. I remember feeling a bit uneasy. Not scared exactly, but aware. Like my instincts were paying more attention than my thoughts were. I kept walking, letting the weight of my shotgun shift in my hands, eyes scanning the undergrowth for movement. The frost was starting to melt, leaving dark patches of earth where my boots pressed down. Thought maybe I'd cut through the valley and loop around the far ridge. It wasn't supposed to be more than half a mile, just a shortcut. Then I saw him. At first I thought it was another hunter, a figure standing in the middle of the trail about 50 yards ahead, still as a post. He was facing me. The light was dim down there, filtered through the pines, but I could see enough. He had an AR-15 in his hands, the barrel pointed down, but his posture wasn't relaxed. The rifle was held at the ready position, elbows slightly bent, his stance balanced like he was waiting for something. The second I saw that, every instinct in me lit up like a warning siren. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel that rush of cold run down my spine. It wasn't fear yet, but something close, something primal that tells you when you've just walked into a bad place. I slowed down, trying not to make any sudden movements. My first thought was to stay calm, act natural, like it was just another guy out hunting. But the longer I looked at him, the more things didn't add up. His clothes were wrong. Torn jacket, greasy cap, mud-caked jeans that hung too loose on his frame. He didn't look like someone out hunting. He looked like someone who'd been living rough for days, maybe weeks. His face was drawn and pale, beard patchy and unkempt. Eyes hollow but sharp, locked right on me. There was something in his stance that made it clear he wasn't surprised to see me. It was like he'd been expecting someone, or maybe he was guarding something. The air between us felt heavy, the kind of tension you could feel pressing on your chest. I stopped maybe 30 yards away. The forest around us went completely silent. Even the small rustles in the brush seemed to vanish. I could hear the faint creak of my own vest as I shifted my grip on the shotgun, keeping it angled low, so it didn't look like a threat. I tried to stay calm, every muscle tight, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I didn't want to provoke him. I didn't want to look scared either. He didn't move for several long seconds, just stood there staring at me. His eyes were dark, sunk deep into his face, and I could see that jittery sort of alertness in his expression, the look of someone who's been running on adrenaline and paranoia for far too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, hoarse, like it hadn't been used much lately. He said he was hunting deer, but deer season wasn't open. And even if it was, nobody used an AR-15 for that. It didn't make sense. I could tell by his tone that he didn't care if I knew it didn't make sense. He just wanted me to understand that I didn't belong there. I looked around a bit, more to buy time than anything. The trees seemed to close in tighter. The trail behind me looked a lot more inviting than the one ahead. Every part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, but I didn't want to make it obvious I was retreating out of fear. I could feel my pulse in my throat. There was something about his expression that stuck with me, like he was weighing something in his head, deciding what to do next. He finally told me in that same slow, dry tone that I might find some birds back the way I came. The way he said it made it sound less like advice and more like a warning. The words had a sharpness to them that left no room for misunderstanding. My gut told me to take the hint. I didn't say anything else. I gave a small nod, kept my hands visible, and started walking backward a few steps before turning. I didn't want to show my back too quickly, but I also didn't want to stand there a second longer than I had to. I walked slowly at first, then a little faster, keeping my ears open for any sound of movement behind me. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no branches breaking. Just that same suffocating silence. I kept walking until the trail curved and he was out of sight, and then I let myself pick up the pace. My boots hit the ground faster and harder than before, echoing faintly through the trees. I must have walked half a mile before I stopped to look back, heart still pounding. The valley seemed darker now, the air thicker somehow. I had that crawling feeling in my stomach that something had just barely gone right, that I'd been close to something that could have gone very wrong. The rest of the way back to my truck felt longer than it should have. Every shadow between the trees looked like it could hide someone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but the woods stayed empty. When I reached the clearing and saw my truck, I felt that first real breath of relief. I loaded my shotgun back into its case, took one last look at the direction I'd come from, and got in. My hands were still shaking when I turned the key. I sat there for a few minutes, just staring out the windshield at the tree line, trying to make sense of it. I knew what I saw. I knew what kind of man that was, and I knew enough to understand that whatever he was doing down there wasn't something I wanted to find out more about. The next morning I called the sheriff's office. I told them everything, where I'd been, what time it was, what the guy looked like, and how he was armed. The deputy I spoke with took the report, said they'd send someone out to check the area. I could tell by the way he said it that they probably wouldn't find anything. That place was too remote, too full of old trails and side paths that led nowhere. I hung up feeling like it hadn't made much difference. But I still felt I had to report it. It wasn't just about me. There were other hunters out there, people walking dogs, families who hike those trails sometimes. For days afterward, I kept thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see him standing there in that valley, motionless, rifle in his hands, eyes locked on me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how wrong everything had been about that scene. He hadn't stumbled on me by chance. He was already there, waiting for something or guarding something. Maybe a camp, maybe a stash, maybe something worse. The way his clothes looked, the state he was in, it told a story. A man who hadn't left that valley in a while, who probably didn't want anyone finding whatever was hidden there. I never went back to that part of the bush again. Every time I thought about hunting out that way, I found another spot instead. Somewhere open, somewhere with people within shouting distance. There's something about standing face to face with a man like that in the middle of nowhere that changes how you look at the woods. You realize how easy it is for things to go bad, how fast a normal day can turn into something else entirely. I've spent my whole life outdoors, walked more trails than I can count, but that day left a mark on me I still can't shake. I still don't know what he was doing there. Maybe the sheriff's office found something, maybe they didn't. They never called me back and I never asked. But every time I think back to that cold morning, I can still feel that moment when the world went silent, when the air got heavy, and I knew without question that I didn't belong there. It's strange how clear that feeling was, how instinct can tell you the truth before your brain can catch up. I listened to it that day, and I'm glad I did. Because whatever was down that trail, past that man, I'm certain it was nothing I wanted to find. When I was growing up, camping was just something my family did every summer, without question. It wasn't really a vacation so much as a tradition. My parents both loved being outdoors, and every year, they'd pack up the van with coolers, folding chairs, old tents, and whatever snacks my mom decided were camping essentials. My sister and I would get shoved in the back seat, surrounded by sleeping bags, half-inflated air mattresses, and the smell of bug spray and sunscreen mixed together. We rotated between a few places, Virginia Beach, Assateague, and a miserable spot called Westmoreland that always seemed to rain the entire time we were there. Westmoreland had mosquitoes that could bleed you dry, and clay mud that glued itself to your shoes. Assateague, though, was my favorite. Even as a kid, there was something special about being near the beach, where the ocean air mixed with the scent of pine and saltgrass, and you could hear the waves faintly crashing, even when you were deep in the campground. The only thing you had to watch out for were the ponies, the famous feral ponies that wandered freely all over the island. It was the middle of July, humid enough that your shirt stuck to you the second you stepped out of the car. The campground was packed that summer. Families, RVs, kids riding bikes, and the constant background sound of people talking and fires crackling. We had 2 tents, one for my parents and one that I shared with my sister. The ground was sandy, and everything we owned got coated in a thin layer of grit by the first night. That night, though, was different. The air felt still. The ocean sounded distant, muffled somehow, like a steady heartbeat far away. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows between the tents, and I could hear crickets chirping near the tree line. My mom woke up first. I don't know what made her stir. Maybe a sound outside or just instinct. I was half asleep, tangled in my sleeping bag, when I felt her move. I opened my eyes just a little, confused, and saw her sitting straight up. She wasn't saying anything. She was just frozen, staring at something near the tent's entrance. Took my sleepy brain a few seconds to focus, but when I turned my head toward where she was looking, I saw it too. In the pale blue light filtering through the thin fabric, there was a shadow, a shape right outside the tent. It wasn't moving much, just standing there. From where I was, it looked like the outline of a person, maybe an old woman. I could make out the curve of a hunched back, the thin strands of long, wiry hair hanging down. It looked like she was leaning forward, peering in through the mesh window of the tent. My heart started beating hard. I couldn't think clearly, just stared at that shadow. It was still, but there was something deeply wrong about how close it was. The thought of someone standing just a few inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of nylon, made my skin crawl. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, or maybe it was just the wind, but every small sound outside suddenly felt too loud. I couldn't tell if my mom was breathing at all. She didn't move. I wanted to say something, but my mouth felt dry, my throat locked up. The seconds dragged by painfully slow, and I felt a kind of cold creep into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. My mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was one of the campers, I thought. Maybe someone got lost coming back from the bathroom. But why would they just stand there watching? Then the figure shifted slightly. I saw the shape of its head tilt, almost like it was sniffing the air, and that movement made it so much worse. The hair caught the moonlight just enough to glint silver, messy and wild. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved suddenly, not even sure why. Maybe to sit up or grab my mom's arm. And the noise I made must have startled whatever was outside, because the shadow jerked back fast in a way no old woman could move. There was a low thud, like something heavy landing on the sand, and then a sudden sound of hooves kicking up dirt. That's when everything clicked. It wasn't a person at all. It was one of the ponies. The shape we saw was just a feral pony with its head bent down, probably sniffing around for food or salt. When it ran off, I could hear the distinct rhythm of hooves striking the hard ground, fading toward the dunes. My mom exhaled a long breath she'd probably been holding the whole time. The realization came all at once, half relief, half embarrassment. We'd set up the tent without realizing it was right across one of the paths the ponies used to get to the beach. They roamed wherever they wanted, even through the campsites. After it ran off, the night felt normal again, but my heart kept racing for a long time. I lay awake, listening to the faint sound of the ocean and the occasional snort or shuffle of movement in the distance. Every so often I'd catch the sound of another pony wandering by, stepping softly over the sand, and I'd tense up again, picturing that same silhouette outside the tent. The next morning we saw clear hoofprints in the sand, only a few feet from where our tent was staked down. There were dozens of them, leading from the trees down toward the water. My dad laughed when my mom told him what happened, but he also pointed out that we really had pitched the tent right in the middle of a well-worn trail. The ponies had probably been using that route for years. Later, When we walked down toward the beach, we saw a small group of them grazing by the dunes. Thick, muscular little ponies with tangled manes and long tails that whipped lazily at flies. They looked beautiful in the daylight, almost harmless. But standing there, watching them move together through the sand, I kept thinking about how human that silhouette had looked in the moonlight. The angle of the head, the curve of the neck, the way the hair hung, it was uncanny. That image stayed with me long after that summer. Even now, when I think about camping, that's the first night that comes to mind. Not the fun parts, not the fires or the waves or the stars, but that eerie stillness in the tent, the feeling of being watched, and the moment the shape outside came to life. It taught me something small but unforgettable, that sometimes fear isn't about what's actually there, but about what you think you're seeing, and how easily, in the quiet dark, your mind can turn something ordinary into something terrifying. But even after realizing what it was, I never really shook the unease of that night. Because while everyone else joked about the ponies and took pictures of them like they were cute little mascots of the island, I always remembered how silently that one stood there. No snorting, no pawing at the ground, no obvious sound, just still right at the tent wall, like it was waiting for something. That was the last time we camped in that particular spot. The next year, my parents picked a different site, closer to the main path and farther from the dunes. It was safer, they said. I never complained. Even though I loved Assateague, I couldn't shake the memory of that dark shape at the tent flap, how close it had been, how real it had felt before it moved. To anyone else, it was just a pony that wandered too close. But to me, it was a reminder that the boundary between comfort and fear is thinner than a sheet of tent fabric. And sometimes, even when you know the truth, it doesn't stop you from glancing at the shadows when the night feels too quiet, half expecting to see that same outline again, standing there, watching in the pale blue light of the moon. I remember how quiet the valley was when I first got there. The kind of quiet that settles deep in your ears, where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stop moving for long enough. I'd been driving for hours through winding mountain roads, the kind that lose signal halfway up the slope and never give it back. I wasn't worried about it at first. In fact, part of me liked the idea of being cut off from the world for a night or two. It was early fall, the air had that cool dry edge to it, and the trees were starting to turn. The valley looked peaceful, thick stands of pine, a river curling through the bottom and trails that stretched out in both directions like narrow ribbons disappearing into the woods. I hiked most of the day, taking my time, not paying much attention to the sun sliding down behind the ridges. I wanted to get one last good look at the trail's end before I turned back, but I misjudged how fast the light would fade in the valley. It got dark fast, faster than I expected, the temperature dropping with it. My plan had been to camp somewhere along the ridge and head out in the morning, but it was getting late, and I still hadn't picked a spot. That's when I ran into the guy. He came walking down the trail from the opposite direction, maybe in his 30s, dressed in worn jeans and a green flannel shirt. He had that kind of easy way about him, like he knew every inch of the place. He told me he was local, that he'd been camping around there for years. Said there was a good spot not far from the road, right near the river, hidden enough to feel private, but close enough that I could get out quick in the morning if I wanted to. I thanked him and followed the directions he gave. Just a narrow pull-off between the trees, half covered by brush. When I got there, I saw what he meant by camouflaged. From the road, you couldn't even tell there was space to pull in. The ground was flat and soft, a mix of sand and pine needles, and the sound of the river was steady in the background, just loud enough to drown out the world. I parked my truck, unloaded a little gear, and built a small fire. The flames lit up the trunks of the trees around me, and the reflection of the fire danced off the sides of my truck. I cracked open a beer, set my camp chair near the fire, and played one of my friend's comedy podcasts. It felt good to laugh out there, even if I was laughing alone. I must have been louder than I realized between the music, the podcast, and my own voice echoing off the trees. The whole valley felt like mine that night, like I was the only person in miles. By the time I finished my third beer, the stars had come out and the fire was burning low. I had my tent in the truck bed, but I decided not to set it up. The ground was hard and cold and I was tired. My truck had a topper, and I'd already thrown my sleeping bag and a few blankets in the back. Just seemed easier to crawl in there than to mess with tent poles and stakes in the dark. I didn't even bother changing. Just kicked off my boots, zipped up the bag, and listened to the river until I drifted off. At some point in the night, I woke up. I couldn't tell why. Maybe a noise, maybe nothing. The inside of the topper was pitch black, except for a faint silver glow leaking through the small windows. I lay there still, listening. The river was steady. No voices, no footsteps, just the wind brushing against the trees. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was just being jumpy and fell back asleep. The morning came bright and cold. I pushed open the back hatch, stretched, and stepped out into the sunlight. The air smelled like wet pine and smoke from last night's fire. I built it back up, cracked open a beer, and started breakfast. Eggs, a couple of sausages, and some bread toasted on the pan. It felt perfect, simple. Just me, the river, and the sound of birds darting between branches. That's when I noticed him. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. Someone standing right at the edge of the clearing, half behind a tree. Then he moved, stepping out where I could see him. He wasn't the guy from last night. This man looked off. His clothes were a mess. Layers of torn jackets, pants that didn't match, and plastic grocery bags tied all over him like makeshift pockets. Some hung from his sleeves, others from his belt, fluttering slightly in the breeze. His beard was long and tangled, streaked with gray, and his skin looked like it hadn't seen a proper wash in months. He didn't say anything, didn't look at me, just stood there, maybe 20 feet away, his eyes on the ground. I tried to keep my voice calm, said something about how nice the day was. Nothing. He didn't even blink. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, so I spoke a little louder, asked if he wanted breakfast. Still nothing. He kept pacing slowly, like he was tracing a line around the edge of my camp, never crossing too close, but never leaving either. There was something strange about the way he moved, slow but deliberate, like he had a purpose I didn't understand. Every few seconds he'd stop and shift his weight, his back to me, then continue pacing. I offered him a beer, thinking maybe that would loosen him up or at least get a reaction. He just turned away again. No sound, no nod, no glance. The longer it went on, the heavier the air felt. The morning sunlight, which had seemed warm a minute ago, now felt sharp and cold. My hands itched to do something, but I didn't want to make it worse. I looked around at my things, my pack, my stove, my cooler. Everything suddenly felt exposed, like I'd made the mistake of laying out too much of myself. I didn't want to show fear, but inside I could feel my pulse quickening. I started moving slowly, pretending to clean up my cooking stuff, but my eyes never left him. He kept pacing, not a word, not even a glance. After a few more minutes, I realized there wasn't going to be any friendly outcome. He wasn't lost. He wasn't curious. He was just there, watching in his own way. I thought about what could have happened if I'd slept in my tent instead of the truck. How easy it would have been for someone to walk right up on me in the night. I reached for my bear spray and my knife. The spray was sitting beside my chair, the knife on the tailgate. My hands shook a little as I picked them up. I took a few steps toward him, the gravel crunching under my boots, and that was when he finally moved. He didn't run or even turn to face me, just drifted away like something pulling him backward into the trees. His steps were slow, unhurried, the sound of plastic bags rustling softly as he disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long minute, staring at the spot where he'd been. My breakfast was burning, the fire popping, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The air felt wrong, heavy, like the world around me was holding its breath. I threw the food aside, doused the fire, and started tossing everything into the truck. My hands moved fast without thought. I slammed the tailgate, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I didn't even bother checking my mirrors. I just drove, gravel flying behind me, eyes fixed on the narrow road until I hit the highway again. Only after a few miles did I start to breathe normal again. I checked my rearview mirror a dozen times, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing, just empty woods and the long, winding stretch of asphalt. It wasn't until later, when I finally got cell service again, that I really let myself think about it. I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering if he'd been there the whole time. Maybe he'd seen my fire, heard me laughing, and crept close enough to watch. Maybe he'd been standing out there while I was asleep, silent, waiting. The thought made my skin crawl. I'd always liked camping alone. The quiet, the freedom, the sense that you could disappear from the world for a bit. But after that morning, the quiet didn't sound peaceful anymore. It sounded like a place where someone could stand in the dark just out of sight, listening, waiting for you to let your guard down. I never went back to that valley. Every time I think about it, I picture that man. His clothes covered in hundreds of plastic bags, the rustling sound they made in the wind. I remember how he wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak, just circled and circled like he was tracing the edge of something invisible. And sometimes late at night I still wonder how long he'd been there before I woke up.